This is Sacred Architectures of Earth from 400 before the Common Era to about 1500 in the Common Era. So let's just start with a quick geographical overview. First, we'll be looking at sites in China, and this is related to chapter 21, The Art of Rising Empires in Japan and China. So we'll be looking specifically at the region right here along the Great Wall, Yongang. Then we will move to the Roman Empire, here shown with the spread of Christianity in the 4th century. And we'll be looking at some sites in Syria at the archaeological dig at Dura Europos right here. And then finally, we'll look at some African areas. We'll be checking out Lalibela here in Ethiopia and Eastern Africa. And then we'll be looking at Djenné in what is today Mali on the Niger River. So we'll start with the Yongang grottos in China. And a grotto is either a man-made or a natural kind of cave. And so you're situating the statues that you see here recessed back into these kind of cave-like structures. And one of the things that's important when we consider this site is that it can only happen, such a monumental work of art and architecture can only happen as states begin to centralize, right? You need an authority to sort of delegate and to fund these monumental art projects. So with the sort of consolidation of rice production, the invention of bronze production, we start to see populations in China and Japan both settling down and becoming more centralized states, which then have the capacity to produce such monumental architecture. The area of Yongang itself is on the Silk Road route. And so this is a busy trading hub. And so we're seeing a lot of different mixing of art and cultural styles because we have different people interacting with each other in the process of doing these economic affairs. So the grottos that you're seeing here, and please note that there are like more than 50,000 statues in this complex. These grottos are carved out specifically of the rock that exists in this location, and that is known as rock cut. So the rock is usually part of the bedrock, or it's a huge piece of rock that can't be moved, and you just sort of carve out of it. And we also sometimes call this rock hewn. So these are in situ. These statues are where the rock came from. And the statues are either in grottos or in more shallow niches or niches. And these are kind of like the less deep cutouts in the rock. So it's been suggested that the statues of Buddha that you see here, the enlightened one, each one represents a different emperor from the Wei dynasty that ruled in the 4th to 6th centuries in the Common Era. And these are monuments to these different emperors. They immortalize them, they associate the living ruler with this spiritual figure, creating sort of a cult of emperors, as we saw with Rome as well. So at a certain point in the 5th century, the emperor of the Wei dynasty decided to abandon his Buddhist beliefs and associate himself with Taoism and instead persecute the Buddhists that had been part of the Wei dynasty before. And so the tremendous amount of deaths probably prompted this sort of expiatory or expiating statues that you see here, statues that are meant to undo a wrong or atone for a wrong. So in Cave 20, which you see here, we have 2 figures that survived, but our historians believe that there was a 3rd one to create a symmetrical staging so that that figure would have been here on this side. And we can see some of the traditional features of Buddha art in these particular statues. The central statue is about 42 feet high. So just think as you're approaching this, how the spiritual elements of this location would sort of trigger feelings of reverence and of awe as you're approaching this huge statue. These statues are carved in high relief, so they are more separate from the backdrop, whereas the carvings that you can see here are in low relief, closer to the surface. Just a couple of details here that help us identify the Buddha. First, his ears are usually depicted as long because before his enlightenment, he was wealthy. And so this is a symbol of wearing heavy jewelry that would stretch out the ears. We can also see the Ushnisha, which is this skull protuberance or head protuberance, sometimes a bun, that's characteristic of the Buddha. We can also see behind in this low relief, a halo or an urna, which is carved with other little figures of the Buddha, sort of lining the interior. And then in addition to the halo, which is just around the head, we have a much bigger halo around the whole body known as a mandorla. And we see this a lot of times in medieval Christian art as well. This is a halo that encompasses the whole body. And just note how excellent and exquisite these folds are. You can see that all of the folds here have just been flattened against his chest, and that his right shoulder is exposed. And typically the Buddha sits in this peaceful meditative position, and his legs are crossed in what we call the lotus pose. Around these statues are other beautifully decorated and colorful additions. So on the left here, we have a sort of protective spirit that guards the exterior. And you can see that even the edges of the timbers here are painted. And then here on the right, we have, again, some little niches or niches with other teeny tiny statues in them. And then everything here is painted very vibrantly. So just all of the artwork serving to sort of embroider this holy space based on these grottos. Here's another example, just so you can see the lotus flowers and just the sort of rampant color and repeated imagery, and just so many sort of stylized features that we can identify as Buddha. Moving now to Dura Europos, and Dura Europos is in modern day Syria, and this was a trade hub as well that was located on the Euphrates River. So that's here, and it's built up on this promontory, so it's quite elevated above the riverbank. You can see it on this map. The sides are flipped just to orient north to the top. We'll be looking at 3 buildings in Dura Europos: the Mithraeum, the synagogue, and the Christian building, which is the house church, all located along this sort of fortified wall. So the city itself was founded somewhere around 300 before the Common Era, and it featured a very cosmopolitan population. We had all different kinds of people from different cultural backgrounds, religions, languages, etc., who would meet here. And in spite of its small size, it was quite bustling. So the Greeks are present, the Parthians, the Romans come and take over for a while, and then the Romans are kicked out by the Persian Empire, which takes over. And in 265, 256 or 265, don't worry, it's not on the quiz, the city just sort of randomly shuts down, and it's probably related to an invasion. But before leaving, the people of Dura Europos actually filled in the synagogue with dirt and gravel and stuff like that to create a bulwark against the advancing Persians, or so historians say. So you can see here it being right on the wall to sort of fortify even further. We'll begin with the Mithraeum, and the Mithraeum is an altar dedicated to the Persian god Mithras. And Mithras was one of the many mystery cults that we see springing up in the period when Christianity is first taking hold in the West. And Mithras is part of this sort of legendary story where he has to kill this spiritual bull in order to release justice into the world. And so we can see in the center of this altar space where ritual sacrifices would have occurred, we can see the Mithras actually battling the bull, and he's kind of got his knee on the bull's back and he's yanking his head back by the horns. So in the same section here, we can see that the person who patronized, or the person who paid for this piece of art, Zenobius, is performing a ritual sacrifice. So the actions of the panel of art are reflecting what kinds of blood sacrifices would be happening in front of it. So the art is reflecting the spiritual and sacred practices that are happening. In this relief, again, fairly low relief, right? It's fairly flat, fairly close to the surface from which it was carved. We can see that Mithras is depicting hierarchical scale. And you guys are familiar with this term. This would have been to show that he was more important, so he's larger than the other figures in the scene, right? All of these individuals are not the same size, but based on the hierarchy that they hold in the image. And also here we have some beautiful paintings of a hunt, again, echoing this idea of Mithras doing this sort of cosmic hunting. We also have a very, very old synagogue in Dura Europos. And the synagogue reflects populations of Jews that were cast out of Jerusalem in the year 70 in the Common Era, when the Romans destroyed the temple that is the heart of Jewish religion and culture for the second time. And this is called the Jewish diaspora, the movement of Jews out of their homeland. And the early art that we have for Judaism is quite rare due to the second commandment in the Old Testament that says that people should not have any graven images or idols. And there's sort of this idea that, well, what we're seeing here are two-dimensional paintings. It can't really be an idol that seems like a god that you could pray to. These are just depictions. And so luckily these have survived. And again, probably because this area was filled in to protect the fresco. And these are all dry frescoes, which means that they're not painted onto wet plaster. So you can see, this is an old photo, but you can see that the color is not quite as vibrant as some of the other frescoes that we looked at, say from the Greek images that we were looking at a few weeks ago. So this area is a niche that is meant to hold the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and this is the sacred text for Judaism, and this would have had a pride of place inside this area. Some of the stories that are being told in these registers, right, these rows of different paintings, are related to Jewish history more broadly. So here on the left is a close-up of just this little panel right here, but this is a symbol of the story of the consecration of the tabernacle. And the tabernacle is the movable or transportable house of God. So here is the tabernacle represented like a sort of ancient Greek or Roman temple. And we can see the menorah, which is used to light the candles during Passover. And on the top, the Ark of the Covenant, which holds the 2 tablets that have the 10 commandments on them. So we see a symbolization of the most important aspects of Jewish history and culture manifest here on these walls, which give it a didactic purpose, right? These stories are meant to teach, and especially to teach illiterate people and sort of ordinary people who would be able to read these images by decoding the specific artistic program rather than having to read words. And then finally, we'll move to the house church. So it should be noted that at this point, Christianity is not a legal religion in the Roman Empire. In its first years of creation, about 30 to 90 in the Common Era, the church was persecuted by the Romans because they refused to join the Roman kind of polytheistic, multi-layered religion. And so if you guys remember from last week, the Rome built its strength on the fact that it enabled local cultures to continue to practice their religions. Christians would not join the civic religion of Rome. And so they were persecuted until in 313, Emperor Constantine, who moves the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, on the Black Sea. In 313, the Edict of Milan makes Christianity a legal religion, and then it's not until 380 that it is the official religion of the Roman Empire. But this makes it all the more special that we have this church, because this is a period when Christianity is kind of practicing underground. And so rather, compared to the synagogue or the Mithraeum, which were built for their religious purposes, this particular building was sort of built into a pre-existing house. And I should point out also that the Mithraeum is underground, representing a cave, and does not have windows. I forgot to mention that earlier. So what you're seeing here is the floor plan of the house church. And this area would probably have been the triclinium, which is the Roman dining room, but now it's the place that is used for the gathering of religious people for rituals. It's especially sensible for Christianity because it's centered around the feast of the Eucharist, of the body and blood of Jesus. And so this part is the baptistry, where baptisms would occur with water anointing. Some of the frescoes are of the earliest images of biblical stories that we have. We've got Jesus walking on water over here with Peter in the boat. And then we've got the 3 women coming to the empty tomb where Jesus was resurrected. This is one of my favorite images of Mary Magdalene and or the other women who are appearing in the stories in the New Testament. What's also unique about Der Europos is we're seeing the development of Christian iconography, so the kinds of symbols that can be read. And these styles change over time, but we see the first glimmerings of things that become dominant Christian features. For example, the fish, which was a symbol of Christian identity, that was kind of like a secret symbol. Like people would, meet each other in the Roman forum and be like, "Oh, are you a Christian?" And then they would just like, use their toe to draw the fish, and then you'd be like, "Okay, we're safe. We're not going to persecute each other." In the center, we've got one of the earliest images potentially of the Virgin Mary nursing Jesus, and this becomes another really famous motif, right? The Virgin as the mother and the bearer of Christ. We have Jesus as the good shepherd with the little goats over here, looking very young, very kind of athletic, rather than the later sort of gaunt, hanging on the cross, broken bodied. And then here we have a scene that kind of echoes the Last Supper, or maybe echoes the Eucharist, process of having the bread and the wine in the church service. So everyone's at table and there's bread here. These images become central to Christian iconography, but we're just seeing like just first very sketchy examples of them here at the service. We'll talk about the catacombs in a second. So, oops, sorry. This is the catacombs of Priscilla. I'm sorry, this is not Dura Europus. These are the catacombs of Priscilla. So these are Roman catacombs. Everything I said about the images stands, but they're just in the wrong location. Sorry about that. As you'll see in the video from Khan Academy, this is a Roman catacomb, and the catacomb is the place where bodies would be deposited for burial. They would be put into niches in the walls and plastered over and painted, which is why it's so important that we have these images. There we go, because these are in places where the Christian dead are buried. Okay, and so here's a catacomb in Paris, and you can see that there were just millions of bodies. And here the label over the door as you enter the catacomb says, "Stop, this is the Empire of the Dead." So it's quite a heavy place to be, and it's a place where you're kind of uniting life in this world with life in the next world. So it's an underground space that links to the afterlife. Okay, moving to our next underground space, we've got the churches in Lalibela in Ethiopia. And these were made by a Christian king of Ethiopia of the Zagwe dynasty. And he built 11 churches in the 14th century. And his goal was to reproduce Jerusalem, right? The Holy Land for Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And what he did was he took important sites from the Bible, from biblical Jerusalem, and reconstructed them in a modified version here in Ethiopia. So for people who wanted to go on pilgrimage, they didn't have to travel to the dangerous Holy Land, where we've got crusades going on, all kinds of things. But instead they could come here. And so pilgrimage is a spiritual journey where you're going from point A to point B and back again. And you'll probably be visiting maybe some body parts of a saint, maybe a holy site. For example, in Islam, the Hajj to Mecca, which we'll discuss in a second. So what you're seeing here are, again, rock-cut churches, rock-hewn churches, which are actually dug directly out of the bedrock. This probably took something like 150 years, even though there were legends that as the workers stopped working for the day, angels would take over and kind of give us this narrative of being so speedily built because they're so holy, but really this would have probably taken a century and a half. And so what you're seeing here is a church dedicated to St. George, which is the Ethiopian patron saint. But we also have other sites around here, like a replica of the Ark of the Covenant, which we just looked at Dura Europus. We've got the manger where Christ was born, duplicated here. We have the River Jordan, which is actually renamed Jordan here in Ethiopia. And we have a hill that represents the Mount of Olives from the New Testament. So all of these biblical sites are basically picked up and moved and recreated here in Ethiopia. The bedrock itself needed to first be carved around the church building, right? So originally this was a block as this part was being carved out, and then little by little doors and windows were added here, and then they could get inside and then carve out the interior of the church. I mean, this is a tremendous task. But inside there's domes, and there's other architectural details that are not this like flat surface. But it's very small in there because obviously it was a huge endeavor. And so people typically line up around the rim of the kind of gorge around the church during ceremonies and pilgrimages. And you can see all the pilgrims here in their white garb. And as such, this is a place where stories from the Bible are acted out and dynamically preached, and it becomes a very sort of stagey festival of Bible stories at saints' days and feast days. You get from place to place by tunnel, you see here. So all of this is carved directly out of the rock. And on the right here, with a beautiful example of Ethiopian art style, we can see the interior of the church. And we've got these fabulous faces in between the timbers on the roof here, detail on every single inch, right? And here we have the main scenes of the crucifixion, but just really done with a specific local style rather than imported from the Roman Empire. And then finally, we have the Great Mosque at Djenné in Western Africa in what is now Mali on the Niger River. And this is a very traditional style of architecture in this area. And it's actually done with mud and clay. So we can call them masons, as you'll see in the particular video that I've assigned you, but mason typically refers to someone who works with stone. So just be aware that we're using the term somewhat broadly. And the mosque, which is the holy place of worship for Muslims, in this floor plan we can see is composed of two large sections. One is interior and one is exterior. So we have this open air courtyard, and oftentimes there are trees planted in them, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's oriented sideways in this image, but the minarets, which you can see here, are towers that on the one hand mark the landscape and let everybody know that there is a Muslim place of worship here. And then secondarily, often serve as the place where the call to worship is coming from, is being announced and sang from. So the minaret is a tall tower that is associated with a mosque. And we can see that this part of the wall is in the direction of Mecca, which is the central city for Islam. And it is one of the particular tenets of Islam that every able-bodied Muslim should make a pilgrimage to Mecca in their lifetime. And this is known as the Hajj. So this is a very particular pilgrimage only to this one location. But to pray towards Mecca and to orient oneself, there's a Qibla wall. And so the Qibla lets us know which direction is Mecca. So which direction are we going to orient our prayer? So you can see that the structure itself is made and covered, with this mud. And in fact, the clay, well, bricks, I guess, for lack of a better word, even though don't imagine that they're all uniform bricks like in a modern day brick building. These are clay bricks that are hardened in the sun and stacked together using mortar. And the mortar is some kind of plastic material, meaning that it is movable and bendable. So think about cement, for example, which would harden after solidifying the bricks together. And then the whole exterior is covered with this particular mud. And so every year it has to be replastered with this mud to protect against erosion from winds and rain and other things like that. And every year there's like sort of festival where this would happen, and people use these jutting out pieces of wood, which are also decorative, to climb the facade and to actually replaster it. And this is a building method that has been used since the 14th century. So here on the right, you can see this is a view from the roof forward, facing the direction of Mecca, facing the Qibla wall with the 3 minarets there. And on the top of each one is an ostrich egg. Okay, so here are your terms. And I want to just point out, please make sure that you're using these terms that I give you every week on the quiz. Do not Google search and come up with some other term. Use the terms that you should be learning for this class that I am handpicking for you in the PowerPoint. So here we have all of the terms. And when you're working on your discussion, I want you to think about how connection to the earth can foster certain spiritual feelings and why these holy sites are all built directly out of or directly using the substances of the earth. Okay,